You're listening to an event from the U.S. Institute of Peace, part of the USIP podcast network. For more information about our work around the world, visit usip.org and check us out on social media.
We are enormously pleased to co-host this panel with the Center for International Private Enterprise, an institution dedicated to strengthening the democratic institutions that enable business and entrepreneurship to flourish. Frank Brown, who directs CIPE's Anti-Corruption Center, will moderate this session. Brown has led programs to support civil society activists in countries as different as Sudan, Armenia, the Gambia, and Malaysia. Before joining CIPE, Frank had a distinguished career as a journalist, including more than a decade as bureau chief for Newsweek in Moscow. Before I start, I'd like to briefly say something about the U.S. Institute for Peace for those who may be unfamiliar with our mission. USIP is a nonpartisan, independent agency established by Congress in 1984 to prevent, mitigate, and reduce violent conflict. We've worked to facilitate peace processes in Colombia for nearly 2 decades and started working in Central America a few years ago to support local grassroots efforts to prevent criminal violence and social conflict. Corruption, as we know, drives and facilitates conflict by subverting justice, eroding trust, and diverting the resources away from essential services. And now I'll turn the session over to Frank Brown. Thank you.
Here we go. It's great to see so many folks turned out on this afternoon, and it's a real privilege to play this role over the next hour and a half or so. I wanted to, first off, talk a little bit about what SIPE does in this space. So SIPE, as Mary pointed out, we're an NGO based here in Washington, D.C. I head up the anti-corruption unit, as Mary pointed out. And this sort of convening, this sort of conversation between folks who have a keen interest in the future of Guatemala and see things through an anti-corruption lens are absolutely essential as we move forward. And it's a real opportunity to speak to such a diverse panel, but even more importantly, to the folks in the audience. So with that, I wanted to make special note of 6 advisors who are here from Guatemala's Anti-Corruption Commission, as well as the executive director of the commission, Julio Flores. These are the men and women who are playing a vital role in advising the Guatemalan government as it forges an anti-corruption reform campaign. Their courage and public service are an inspiration to all of us in the global anti-corruption community. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for, I'm hoping, playing an active role in the Q&A portion, because you're the people that make this all real. So thank you on many levels. Before we actually begin in earnest, I wanted to introduce my colleague, Martin Friedel, who heads up the Latin America and Caribbean unit at SIPE, and who has some fresh insights from Guatemala, having been there just last week. Martin?
Yes, thank you, Frank, for that introduction, and it's a pleasure being here. Now we do it with the right microphone. Being here with our distinguished panelists, as well as with Commissioner and all you consejeros delegados. As Frank mentioned, I had the opportunity to be in Guatemala last week. Also had a meeting with the consejero and President Arevalo. And as SIPE, we've been working in Guatemala for more than 20 years and currently have a lot of programming trying to support the new administration, always coming from our background of working with local private sector, civil society. So we hope that this panel and our engagement with USIP is productive for the comisionado and the consejeros delegados, and that we can help sort of drive these reform efforts, which we know are a priority for the Arevalo administration. So anyways, we hope the panel is interesting, and also we'll be around here with a few colleagues for the Q&A session. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin. So I wanted to sort of frame this event a little bit and talk about why we're here. And first up, we're here to talk about the role that business can play in fighting corruption, and especially how business can be especially effective in fighting corruption when it acts collectively. And that's because business, for often very good reasons, is typically quite shy about addressing corruption as an individual business, because the risks are quite high, both to the business's reputation, and operations, and sometimes the actual lives of the business leaders. And that's true especially in highly corrupt environments where violence is part of the political culture. And I can think of a couple countries where we work in the former Soviet Union, in Africa, and in Southeast Asia where that's true, where that dynamic is true. But that said, business, as it develops, as it grows, as every business hopes to do, in my experience, they increasingly embrace the rule of law and anti-corruption principles, because without embracing those two elements, they can't begin to access global markets and join global supply chains and access the credit that they need to grow. So there's a natural dynamic, an organic dynamic. As businesses grow, they embrace rule of law. They're searching for ways to talk about it, to advocate for anti-corruption reform, but they can't do it as an individual business, and they'll turn to others, and like some of the speakers we'll hear from, to provide the leadership and cover they need to move forward. This is especially true for SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, and that's at the heart of SIPE's work, because we exist not so much to represent, or not at all to represent, the multinationals of the world. Apologies, Walmart, but to represent smaller businesses, because they typically lack the resources to put in place anti-corruption programs and perhaps don't fully understand what the benefits are that flow from a strong anti-corruption compliance program. So I wanted to give very briefly one example of SIPE's collective action work, and that comes from Thailand. So Thailand, highly corrupt Southeast Asian country, lots of big Thai businesses, lots of multinationals operating there, a government that does not care too much about corruption, says all the right things, doesn't do much. So this is an environment where businesses got together about 13 years ago and said that we're tired of being saddled with a negative reputation that Thailand has as a highly corrupt environment, a lawless environment. And we're going to get together, these businesses, and we're going to create an initiative to advocate for anti-corruption reform. So all these businesses got together. I think there were about 13 in the beginning. They make a verbal pledge in writing as well that we will uphold the anti-corruption principles. So the pledge means pretty much nothing, right? It's just a pledge. But then in year 2 and 3, they actually subject themselves to third-party audits. So that means the company is saying, we're going to actually take these concrete steps. I think there's 73 of them. And we're going to invite a third-party auditor to come in and check whether we've done this or not, and then make the results public. That's when it got real. And now this initiative has grown to over 1,000 companies, and inadvertently, this initiative has substantial political power, because when it comes to issues pertaining to the business sector and anti-corruption, journalists and the government itself now turn to this collective action group for advice and guidance. So that's extraordinarily hard to achieve. We've only done it in Thailand on that scale. It's a remarkable achievement. I don't know if we'll ever do it again like that successfully and that big, but it sort of brings to life what's possible. So I wanted to dive in to the more interesting speakers on this at this table, our panelists. And what I'm going to do is introduce each panelist, ask them a question. They'll speak for 5 to 7 minutes. And then at the end, I'm hoping they'll sort of speak to each other. I'll help them do that. But we'll have some cross-pollination. Then we'll take a break for 30 minutes, and then we'll come back for Q&A. And that's when I think one of the most interesting parts of this will be when we'll have some interaction with you, especially with the advisors. So I'm going to start off with Lisa Miller, who I've known for years, and is somebody who at the World Bank has been a guiding light for much of the work we do at SIPE. So by way of background, Lisa is the World Bank Group Integrity Compliance Officer, and she heads up the Integrity Compliance Unit in the World Bank Group's Integrity Vice Presidency. She previously was a senior counsel in the World Bank's Legal Vice Presidency, focusing on sanctions and legal procurement matters. Prior to joining the World Bank, Lisa was in private legal practice in Boston and Washington. Her practice focused mostly on integrity compliance, sanctions, public procurement, and corporate matters. So my question to Lisa is in front of me. Okay. So my question, Lisa, to you is, what strategies can be employed to enhance collaboration and strengthen anti-corruption commitments among key stakeholders such as governments, businesses, and civil society organizations?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Frank, and thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. Before I jump into the question, I was asked to just give a very brief overview of what the Integrity Compliance Office at the World Bank does. And I'll be very happy during the Q&A if folks have questions on that as well. So the Integrity Compliance Office at the World Bank Group primarily works with entities that have been found through the World Bank Group's administrative sanction system to have engaged in fraud and corruption under World Bank Group finance projects. As a result of those findings, the companies or individuals will be sanctioned, meaning that they will be, in most cases, debarred, declared ineligible to participate under World Bank Group finance projects for a certain minimum period of time. And at the end of that period of time, they generally can only be released from the sanction if they've met specified conditions. In most cases, those conditions require the entities to put in place some type of integrity compliance measures that reflect the principles set out in the World Bank Group Integrity Compliance Guidelines. And I want to pick up on something Frank said. We don't work only with large companies. We work with a lot of SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises. And so our expectation is that the entities will tailor their integrity compliance measures to their own risk profile, their own circumstances, their size, their areas of operations, some cultural expectations, et cetera. And we, in addition to working with those entities to meet the conditions for release, we engage in a lot of outreach. So our outreach can be in the form of workshops where we speak about integrity compliance principles. It can be in the form of the issuance of learning tools. And at the Q&A, happy to talk more about these if there's an interest. But we have developed earlier this year, it was published, an integrity compliance guide for SMEs. It was developed by us together with the Korean Ministry of Justice. We also have developed an integrity compliance knowledge sharing platform. There's a QR code for anyone who's interested that has learning tools and resources. So I just wanted to get give you a feel for what we do before I jump into how what we do can be done on a more global scale. And by that, I mean the collective action in which we engage. So, what strategies can be employed to enhance collaboration, commitments among stakeholders? I think to start, it's finding a common issue. What is it? What is the anti-corruption initiative? What is the integrity compliance initiative that you hope to address? And then who are the relevant stakeholders? There's the private sector, there's the government counterparts, there are CSOs, NGOs, and others, academia, who all bring something to the table. So for example, the CSOs can act as facilitators to initiate the discussion. They can provide training. They can increase public awareness around that common issue that you want to address. And they can also influence decision-making to a degree. So how do you identify these relevant stakeholders? How do you find your common issue? And I want to also note that these can be big initiatives, these can be small initiatives. I was speaking at an event a few months ago, and there was a gentleman from a collective action initiative in Italy, and it was fascinating because I didn't even know this existed, but these were like the key pasta machine makers, and there's only 3 or 4 of them. But they've developed this initiative among just themselves. But the good news is they're now all operating under the same integrity standards. And then there are some global initiatives that include many members. And I just want to talk about one of them to kind of touch upon these points of identifying the issues and identifying the stakeholders. And it's just one example of many, but it's one with which I'm quite familiar. So it's the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network, also known as MASN. So how MASN started was, there were a group of large, and they were large, now it's expanded to include some smaller entities as well, but these large shipping companies got together and were talking about the challenges they were facing in certain ports, being asked for illicit payments as they entered the ports. You cannot come into port, you cannot unload your goods unless you provide us with a little something in order to be allowed to do that. And it was becoming a very significant issue, not only due to the costs, but there were risks involved if you didn't pay. And they also had, there would be loss of goods. Let's say they had a ship full of produce. Your produce is going to rot if you're not allowed to unload and deliver. So these ship owners got together and said, how do we want to address this? And the initiative with which I am most familiar is what Massen's work in Nigeria. So these ship owners got together, identified the issue. We want to try to find a way to address this ask for illicit payments at the port. Now, who are our counterparts in the government? Well, they were the customs agents. They were some of the other port authority officials. So then they started to broaden the conversation. They spoke to the port agents, officials. They spoke to the customs agents, and they said, you know, we're not going to make these payments anymore. We need you to do something with us. We can't just sit there and say we're not going to pay if there isn't some recourse for the guys on the dock who are asking for the payments. So they developed a system whereby they got these officials on board, and the government was now saying, this isn't allowed. This isn't something that we are going to permit. We are now going to take recourse if our officials, are asking for these illicit payments. And so eventually the message started to get out, and the port workers were saying, oh my gosh, I could actually lose my job. Something can actually happen if I do this. You know, before no one cared, but now not only are the ship owners refusing to pay, but our bosses are actually taking action if we're doing these things. And so now what they've done, they've actually set up an alert system with the ship owners, with the government, with third-party overseers, kind of the neutrals, who a ship will send an alert and say, hey, I expect to be in port in an hour. So now everyone's on notice that the ship is coming in, and the officials can say, hey, this ship is coming in. You all know what to do and what not to do. And then the ship comes in, and if someone asks for an illicit payment, the captain can send an alert. And now it's not just going out into some ether that no one ever deals with. This guy's boss is now going to find out that the guy asked for the illicit payment. So there's actions that are now being taken. And so what they have found is through this initiative, the asks have become less frequent, and things are working much more smoothly. And so now this is being replicated elsewhere in India and other areas where there's significant shipping industry. And so that's just one example where it started out simply by identifying the issue. Relevant private sector entities talking about the issue. Those entities then saying, okay, now who do we need to talk to in the government? Getting those people to sit at the table. And then getting a process in place to actually address the issue. So it can start small. It can start just with an idea, and then getting the right people to the table and taking it forward. So I think, you know, that's really one of the strategies. Identify the issue, identify the relevant stakeholders, and then sit together to try to come up with a way to address those issues. So thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, and the work of the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network is one of my favorite anti-corruption sort of narratives involving an NGO. I remember the head of it talking about the cartons and cartons of Marlboro cigarettes that captains would have to keep with them as they tried to pass through the Suez Canal and hand out cigarettes to everybody who needed an okay passage. But that's a fantastic anecdote. I wanted now to turn to Welby Lehman, who's the Senior Director for Global Government Affairs at Walmart. That's his formal title. But informally, he's one of those rare people within Washington who has his day job at Walmart, which I'm sure he, does very well. But he also has this ability to see across lines and beyond silos and understand how Walmart's work, which is often quite substantial in its potential to change behavior in Guatemala, for example, he can see the connection between Walmart's formal work and how it benefits all these other actors, including folks in this room. And so not only does he see that, but he talks about it. And so So it's a real privilege to have him on the panel. Just to give a little background on him, he was formerly, he had an impressive career in the private sector and government. He was the trade counsel to the U.S. House Ways and Means Committee, and he also managed passage of the U.S.-Colombia trade agreement, and he had stints at the U.S. National Security Council and the U.S. Treasury. So, Welby, the question I'm going to ask you is, what sort of challenges and opportunities has Walmart had in its Guatemala experience? How have digital tools helped you respond to the challenges? And then finally, if you could walk us through a bit the program design phase that we'd been discussing earlier, and the ways in which your small suppliers and subnational actors have fed into a larger collective action effort.
Outstanding question by somebody who, I mean, basically, when he says I think or see, it's through Frank. So I'm thankful for that. I hope that Frank and others don't mind that I invited one more panelist to join us. This is Kamala Harris. Let's see if it comes through here.
I love Venn diagrams, so I just do. Whenever you're dealing with conflict, pull out a Venn diagram, right? And so, you know, the three circles. And so I add.
Okay, so I love Venn diagrams. Whenever you're dealing with conflict, make a Venn diagram. Now, that person has a 50-50 chance of being the president of the United States. So my thesis here is, if you want to do collective action, you better make the Venn diagram now, because you're going to need it. That's a Venn diagram. It's three circles with common cause in the middle. So I just want to use that as sort of architecture for some lessons about collective action from work that we do of the in exactly the way that Frank teed up there. And I'll do it with three Venn diagrams. Actually, I'm cheating with two of them. I'm going to make it two circles. Imagine two circles, and they partially overlap. And the one is Peoria, Illinois, and the other one is Huehuetenango, Guatemala. I heard Bernardo Arevalo speak in New York just recently, and he specifically mentioned caring about inclusive economic development in Huehuetenango. As it turns out, our own work in Guatemala, everything that we do, one of our tests is we ask, how would this play in Huehuetenango, Guatemala? Why? Because of that Venn diagram. Like if Kamala Harris loses the presidency, it will be in part because 10% of Huehuetenango gave up on Huehuetenango and Guatemala and left to go north in an 18-month period, 10%. And that's relevant to people who live in Peoria. Why do I mention Peoria? Because the average politician in the United States has been taught for many years that they should run past all of their political decisions, at least at the national level. How would this play in Peoria? My reason for that Venn diagram is you quickly realize the power of root causes of migration as a driver of realities and commitments in both Peoria and in Huehuetenango. And you realize something else. Do not be a top-to-top collective action person, because collective action is about being rooted in the lived experience in Huehuetenango, in Peoria, and everywhere else. So I know many people who are outstanding, lived experience, rooted, grassroots people in Latin America, but when they come to the United States, they're tops, right? Let's go meet with just the State Department and so forth. You need to understand the realities of Peoria as well here, because that's going to drop, because the president certainly has to. So that's the first one. And that first Venn diagram, lessons learned, lived experience is the whole point. You need to know the lived experience. That gets me to Frank's point that why is Walmart relevant? Because we're a big institution, because of scale for good. That's what every big company says. No. I didn't say yes and. No. No, actually, that's not why. In fact, that is the siren song that leads people towards excessively institutionalized thinking, out of which drop all the lived experience. And they get the design wrong. They get the purpose right. They're definitely going to have an anti-corruption and integrity program and all that. And they're again and again and again, systematically, they're going to get the design wrong and then wonder, why does this stuff never work? Because it's not that stuff. It's the lived experience that gets you the design right. But you have to start with the lived experience at the very start, which means the actual people who have the lived experience. That's the first thing. Second thing is hope. Huehuetenango won't change overnight with regards to its ability to provide a fulfilling, prosperous economic opportunity to its residents. But it can produce overnight hope, a flourishing of hope, rational hope. And that is why sequencing matters. It does matter what you start with. I'll give you an example. We think, obviously, with digital tools for rule of law and inclusive opportunity, which is what we work on, we think that you could do all sorts of wonderful things using digital tools to improve transparency and economic opportunity. But look at the case of Guatemala. Look at the case of Ghana instead of Guatemala. They started with tax administration and they got riots in the streets because people didn't have hope yet. And they were right not to have hope, that improved, more transparent tax administration wouldn't just result in it falling into the same corruption bucket where people they don't trust misuse their tax money. So it's the wrong place to start. Do you have to get to it quickly? Yes, but you get to it after investing in something that more immediately people trust. We are reverse engineering a vicious cycle that's been going like this. That means the little things you do here had better be well designed and well chosen. And so let me get then to the other two Venn diagrams to prove that, what that means for us in Guatemala. The second one is two circles brought together, economic inclusion and rule of law. These are not two separate root causes. They're one and the same. If you do them in stovepipes, everything you do in rule of law will have a decent chance of inadvertently undermining, not neutral, undermining economic opportunity. If you don't believe it, let me quote somebody so important that I won't say who her name was, what her name was, but someone very important in anti-corruption in Guatemala gave, quote, unsolicited advice to Walmart and said, don't buy from any Guatemalan companies. They're corrupt. That supply chain will just get you into trouble. Now, what does that mean in Huehuetenango? Terrible idea. But she was working in her own little stovepipe, her own little rule of law stovepipe, and the problem with that, and I could say the other way too. Lots of businesses doing great things for economic opportunity, but they're undermining rule of law. Even the ones that aren't bad, like actively bad, corrupt, are undermining rule of law by not doing the design thinking together. So that the intersection of those two circles means something in particular. If you're standing at the river where that woman was, you need to go further upstream and further downstream from where she was and say, okay, I need to go downstream to the lived experience. Make sure that what I do right now, not 3 years from now, will Huehuetenangueños, is that right? Will say, yeah, I see it. And in like manner, upstream from there. So there are places in the broader cross-sectoral reality where you get a cesspool of corruption, and it also happens to be an authorizer of inclusive economic opportunity. What would Bernardo Arevalo or anyone else in Guatemala at a senior level ask a company like Walmart to do? Two things: put investment where it's not, to produce jobs for those who don't have them, and integrate my people, especially my small guys, into your supply chain. What was the first thing that happened when Guatemala and the U.S. government ramped up tons of enforcement in Guatemala? Lots of small folks who were still making the transition into the formal sector got audited and so forth, and then the large companies that they were a part that in whose supply chain they operated were held responsible for it. Reasonable Coase theorem application. I mean, who has time to bring 100,000 suits or cases if you could bring one or two? Great, makes perfect sense. What was the CFO response in every company? Get rid of all of those suppliers. Get rid of them. Get them out now. They're dangerous. They're risky. I don't want them. Doesn't play in Huehuetenango. Doesn't work. It's you're robbing from one to pay for the other. It doesn't go anywhere. Why do we not make progress? That's the structure that causes us not to make progress. So as a result, we moved upstream and we said, look, digital licensing and permitting, for example. Licensing and permitting is a cesspool of corruption everywhere, here in the U.S. And simultaneously, it's the official authorizer of almost all economic activity. It's very hard to do anything. You can't build an addition on your house here without getting a license or a permit. Essentially everything needs a license and a permit. So there's a space where if you do it and you improve both the transparency and the effectiveness of that system, what happens? A lot of entry-level construction workers get hired the very next day to do groundbreaking. It's immediate job creation. By the way, you can improve the tax system and companies will factor it in, and 3 years later, they'll increase their investment plan based upon it. Not so licensing and permitting. That's stuff that already went through 3 years of planning and they're just waiting for their permits. So that's the second one. Now the third one, which I have to do extremely briefly, is if you look at something like that, at licensing and permitting, then you have to do something that's terrifying. You have to accept that we're probably wrong in a group like this when we get the sense that, wow, there's a real critical mass for anti-corruption. There's not. We're going to have to design something that will work in part because it recruits untrustworthy people to the cause. In other words, all Venn diagrams have a lot of white. That's non-aligned. In other words, these are people who they're doing what we want in this part, but out here, these are not, there's a lot of non-alignment. We don't agree about a lot of things. I'll tell you one thing we can't agree about if we want to make progress on anti-corruption. We can't agree on why we're doing a project. You can't get a critical mass of people who say, well, I'm going to do this with you, and the why, we're all the same. I'm doing it because I believe in anti-corruption. No, we need the people who are like, I don't really love anti-corruption. I consider it bitter medicine. But you know what? I'm willing to do it because during COVID, all of my licenses and permits got paralyzed. So the old way I used to do, go down to the country club and lose a game of poker, and the next thing I know I have my permit, there are no poker games. There's no country club. What do I do now? I need some resilience. I need some predictability. And if you're telling me that a digital system will give me my permits more predictably, you know what? I hate the transparency part of it, but okay, let's do it. So that Venn diagram, I think post-COVID, we're in a golden moment right now. While people still have post-traumatic stress disorder from COVID, let's go all in on digital tools that are at the intersection of resilience from digital with inclusion, with an eye on Huehuetenango, and transparency. But that means we need all three champions in the room at the same time. Champions for those three things. Resilience. Sometimes we can call it such a dirty word as just doing business efficiencies, right? Together with transparency and inclusion. Sorry.
Colby, that was great and a lot to unpack. And I could see our next speaker vigorously agreeing with many of your points and laughing at some of them, probably in a good way. So our next speaker, thank you so much, Tanya Chovanska, for staying up late there in Paris, where it's after 8:30 p.m. A little background on Tanya. So she is with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, and she's the head of the Business Integrity Program of the Anti-Corruption Network for Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And that's a part of the world that I used to work in and cover for USIP. And I had the privilege to do. I'll be there next March as well, but every March going to Paris to take part in Tanya's Anti-Corruption Network discussions, where there's a fascinating cross-pollination between government of folks working in the anti-corruption space, business people, CSOs. It's all private, closed doors, a lot of sharing of information, inspiration. And so you have in that space countries like Kazakhstan, which are making remarkable strides forward after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and their need to reconsider their alliances. And then other countries in the region, perhaps they're 20 years behind, but you can see them sort of feeding off each other. Tanya oversees that effort. By way of background, prior to the OECD, Tanya worked at the ABA and CELI Ukraine program as the deputy country director. And Tanya, my question for you is, how can companies and economic sectors design effective incentives that deter corrupt practices while promoting ethical behavior within their organizations? And I'd love to hear about what sorts of incentives you think are especially useful. And then how do we, on a sectoral basis, focus on the incentives rather than the disincentives, which I think touches a bit on what Welby was talking about as well. Tanya?
Yes, thank you. Hi, good afternoon. I'm completely confused in times, but good afternoon, I guess, for all of you. First of all, I'm really sad about the fact that I'm not there in person, so that I could participate in the panel live, but I'm happy that I had this opportunity to join. I absolutely enjoyed and loved the two answers before me, and I would like to thank Welby, because he really kind of laid the ground for what I will try to talk about. And the question on the incentives, I think it's a huge question, and the one that my organization is trying to tackle for a very long time, since 1997. And if I could answer that in 5 to 7 minutes, I would be gold, but I will try to at least start the conversation about it, so that we could all start thinking about it and see what could be done effectively and efficiently. I think that I will actually, I love the idea of the diagram in the middle, in between the two issues of rule of law and economic opportunity. And in fact, I believe that incentives is exactly in the middle, because it is something that should bring economic opportunity and should bring benefits for those who will engage in good corporate behavior, and will not engage in corruption, but it should be done within the scope of the rule of law. So I think that that's kind of a perfect ground for what I would talk about. And just very briefly, as I said, my organization has been working on this issue for a very long time. And in fact, there are two ways how we work on that. I mean, the first one is very obvious and basic, is that my organization, the OECD, is a standard setter on the issues of business integrity. So we have something that probably all of you are familiar with, but if you're not, I'm also happy to pass on the references to all of our legal instruments through our partners in USIP. But we have something that is called the OECD Convention on Combating Bribery Foreign Public Officials in Business Transactions, which is kind of the key instrument under which we are operating. And that is supported by a number of other instruments, and in particular, the most recently updated one, something that we call the Anti-Bribery Recommendation, which sets standards for good compliance programs, but also sets standards and requirements on what the countries should be doing in order to help or incentivize or disincentivize the business community to do the right thing. So this is one way how my organization has been working on this. And we have also a set of standards for state-owned enterprises, because the convention that I mentioned and the recommendation looks kind of broadly at the internal controls and compliance mechanisms for all types of businesses, but we also have something for state-owned enterprises. We have something on responsible business conduct. We have something in particular on the M&As, so multinational enterprises. So we have kind of a host of different standards to which the countries sign up, and then we hold them responsible to that. And then the second way how we work on this issue is that we do a lot of conversations, consultations, analysis of what that means in practice, and what in practice, what kind of incentives could be working, what could be driving the corporations and businesses, large and small, to do the right thing, or to basically to not break laws and not to engage in corrupt practices. And this work is still in progress. I think we still don't have all the answers. We are just kind of figuring out what has been working. And of course, as Welby was saying, in fact, what we see still is that the biggest driver of good corporate behavior is sanctioning. So basically the disincentives. Because this is something that works both for the on the company level and the sectoral level, on the level of the national level, the countries, regions, and so on. So basically, the sanctions is still the main incentive or disincentive that is in play. But I think that today I want to talk about something that is more complicated, which is basically the positive incentives and what those are, what makes them work, and how they could be designed. And I think that since the question is kind of asking, since you, Frank, asked what the companies can do and what the sectors can do, I think that these are, in a way, different actions, but in fact, they are quite similar. And I think that I will start with kind of the basics, and they are very obvious, but in fact, they kind of always need to be spelled out. So, how to design the effective incentive? I mean, the number one, and I think, again, as I said, is super obvious, is that they should be real. So they should actually bring the benefit to those who will be involved in, or who would be incentivized. So if we are talking about on the company level, then these things could be anything from we are seeing in some of our countries practices where the companies are introducing rewards for example, blowing the whistle on particular type of corrupt practices. We are seeing something at the top level, for example, setting KPIs for the management of the companies, and in those KPIs, including the functioning anti-corruption mechanisms, and the company not being involved in corrupt practices. And so basically that will bring the benefit to the person to either report or to ensure that the company is engaging or developing a good anti-corruption mechanism within. On the level of the sectors, there are a lot of different initiatives. And again, I think that this is something that has been just developing. And I very much liked what Lisa was talking about. And I love the description and what is behind the maritime collective action, because it has to be something very real. So basically it has to be some sort of benefit. So for example, it could be something as simple as giving a tax break to companies that have good compliance programs. Or, for example, when the tax administration, IRS, or any other administration which is responsible for tax inspections, looks into and designs the plan to do the inspections, they would have a green list of companies that would not be going through these inspections, but they would be going through these inspections only, let's say, once every 3 years, and not randomly as others could be picked. For some countries and some sectors, for instance, we are seeing a lot of corruption in customs, and this is kind of a little bit towards what Lisa was talking about. In some countries, our governments have tried to incentivize through, for instance, creating green corridors for companies that have good compliance programs, that have functioning, effective internal controls mechanisms. And that is kind of the benefit that should be there. So number one, the incentive should be real and should bring the benefit. Number two is, of course, it should be very clear. So what I mean by this is that the rules should be clear. It should be clear what kind of behavior would be incentivized and in what way. And for this, again, at the company level, we are talking about creating clear rules and anti-corruption policies, which clearly state that, I don't know, giving a bribe to a public official would result in a particular sanctioning of this person. At the same time, it's very important that these incentives are known. So that's a number 3. So basically, it should be clear to all the potential actors or beneficiaries, let's say, that there are such incentives. And that, again, works both on the company level and it works on the level of the sector. So on the company level, again, all of the anti-corruption policies, rules should be communicated to all of the employees. They should be aware that these are the rules. There should be a tone from the top, so the management should communicate that there is no tolerance of corruption and what could be the results of breaking these rules. The same on the sectoral level, and this is very important, and I think that this brings us again back to a little bit of what my other colleagues were talking about. And what I mean is that there should be a clear knowledge, information sharing, kind of public awareness, or the state institutions that are responsible for either anti-corruption or particular economic regulations, licenses, or whatever. They should make it known to all the economic actors that if they introduce good internal controls programs, they will receive benefit A, B, C. So this should be publicly known. And then there should be kind of clear guidelines on what exactly is expected of the companies in terms of good compliance programs. And this brings me to something that we were talking about, or my colleagues were talking about, and that's the certification. So who decides, and how do you decide what is a good internal controls or anti-corruption compliance mechanism within the company? And here, there is a very strong role, and we're seeing it evolving in many of our countries, and that's the role of the collective actions, because very often it's either the government that takes upon itself to decide to kind of evaluate, like it is done in parts in the US, like it is done in the UK, where the government decides that this constitutes a good or effective functioning internal controls program within the company. But very often countries are also opting for something that they kind of source it out to the private sector or to the collective actions. And so collective actions could play a role and are well positioned to play a role to do this type of certification to figure out that this company does have a good internal controls mechanism. So, as I said, first, I'm just coming back. First, the incentives should be real. Second, they should be clear. Third, they should be known. And then the most important part is that they should work in practice. So again, that brings us, I think, to kind of the most important part, how to make them work in practice. And of course, it means that the incentives should be fair, that the incentives should be enforceable. So if we talk about this incentives, that's quite easy. I mean, you can take a look at whether the, I don't know, legislation on anti-corruption or liability of legal persons is being enforced or not. With the incentives, it is more difficult to prove that they are being implemented. And I think that it's very important to have the track record that, for instance, these companies that had good compliance mechanisms did receive the incentives. So again, this is a very good role for the collective actions to take upon themselves to kind of publicize this, to play a watchdog role, if you wish, to ensure that the incentives are fairly and properly awarded to the companies, to the proper companies. And then I will come back. So these are the 4 kind of main factors that should be in place in order for the incentives to be working. And I will probably come back a little bit to the collective actions. And my colleagues were talking about different benefits of the collective actions. And I think that these benefits also play out very well in terms of, in the framework of the incentives. So As was discussed already, the collective actions provide kind of the multiplying effect. So for the incentives, it is important, as I said, that the internal controls in the companies or in the sectors are done properly. And very often the smaller companies, the small and medium enterprises do not have the necessary resources to do the training, to develop the proper mechanisms, to know even what the proper mechanisms are, how to put in place, I don't know, clear rules, what those clear rules should be, how to communicate them correctly, how to do the training of the staff, how to set up the reporting channels, how to create the whistleblower protection mechanisms within the companies, how to empower the compliance services to act on whatever corrupt practices that they uncover. So for all of that, the collective actions could help because they pool the resources for the training, for the advice, for the guidance and the devising of these mechanisms that could be then used in order to receive the incentive or the benefit through the incentive. Then the second thing where the collective actions are very important in the context of the incentives, and this was also mentioned by my colleagues before in kind of different contexts, but by uniting, the businesses would have a bigger chance to have the influence that they wish on the governments. So they would have a chance to get to the table, to be in the discussions when the government is deciding and devising the incentives that would make sense for the businesses. But this is also super beneficial for the governments because the governments then could hear kind of in more, let's say, concentrated form what the interests of the businesses are and what could make sense or what could be a real benefit or what could bring a real benefit and therefore make an incentive worthwhile for the businesses to engage in the good corporate behavior. So basically, the collective actions would allow the businesses, small, medium, big, to have a kind of a bigger weight and a better place at the table when the incentives are being devised. And this also goes towards the sanctions or towards the disincentives. So this is another role for the collective actions in terms of working on incentives. And then finally, as kind of, I think, again, very logical, the collective actions help raise the bar, which I think is very beneficial for the government, because the collective actions could set the standards and say that this is what we, the honest business, this is how we, the honest business, want to do business, because for us it makes sense, because it is economically sound. And then the other businesses have kind of a peer pressure, would have a peer pressure. And so the setting of the bar is very important and could be done through the collective actions and could be another benefit vis-a-vis the incentives of businesses going and doing it jointly rather than separately, kind of fighting this fight. I think that for different sectors, different incentives would make sense. So for this, I probably would really have to have much more time to kind of delve into, and I would be very happy to answer any of the questions as we go on. And I think that one last point that I wanted to say is that I think that collective actions are very important in building the trust between the government and the businesses, because my organization is working very much with the governments, and we are trying to figure out the role of the government in incentivizing and enforcing the integrity standards in doing business. So very often we see that the governments don't trust the business doesn't trust the government. So I think that the collective action could be a very good, honest broker between the two, sometimes and often well-meaning players, stakeholders, actors, in order for them to engage in the dialogue. So I think that the collective actions could be a very good platform for a dialogue on developing the incentives that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. And it's interesting you mentioned the certification dimension of collective action, which touches on audits, which will be our next subject. Before we get to that, I wanted to make a quick programming note. Evidently, we can go a little long with this session, so Mike, don't worry, you'll have enough time to speak. And then we also will be able to take some questions as well at this stage, because this is the public part of the program. So this is the big chance for folks who are online or part of the public to ask questions. So with that, I wanted to recognize our next speaker, who I think probably has traveled further than anybody in the room except for the advisors from Guatemala. He came from Texas, and so this is Mike Denley, who's from Texas A&M University, and he's our academic expert. So he's going to ground his presentation in, I think, probably a more rigorous sort of standard than at least my remarks adhere to. So his focus, Mike's focus, is on political economy of development with an emphasis on corruption, foreign aid, and natural resources. His work appears in the Annual Review of Political Science and the Journal of Conflict Resolution. Outside of academia, Mike has worked or consulted for the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, USAID, U.S. State Department, and the EU Commission. And Mike, my question to you, driven in part by the fact that you wrote your dissertation on audits and connections to political bias. So my question to you is, given your expertise on Guatemalan audits and the political economy of international development, what are the best approaches for raising public awareness about corruption and developing targeted messages that resonate?
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Frank, and thanks, Sophia, also for the invitation, and really honored to be here with such an esteemed panel. So I'm not going to delve right into the academic things right away because I think I would lose everybody. So I'm going to tell a story about how I got into these academic things, and then hopefully I can capture your attention the whole time. So yeah, why am I here to speak about audits and corruption in Guatemala? So I actually came to study audits and corruption in Guatemala by chance. So for my PhD dissertation, which was in part inspired by the Nobel Prize the other day to Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson about politics and political institutions, I particularly wanted to know which combination of political institutions and economic circumstances would help really reduce corruption, right? But in order to do that rigorously, we need data. So yeah, for a long time, academics have been using Transparency International's control or their perceptions index or the World Bank's control of corruptions index. But for a long time, we academics have really known that these data are not really great for capturing actual corruption. They're capturing perceptions of corruption, which is shown to be different. So I wanted to really get some sort of objective measure of corruption, and I was working in the World Bank's anti-corruption unit, and actually I'd run into Lisa a few times back in the day. There was previous academic work on audits and corruption in Brazil, but everybody just kept on writing about Brazil. And I thought, well, let's look somewhere else. So I looked with help from a lot of research assistants. We looked all over the world trying to find countries that would actually release their audit data. And lo and behold, actually, Guatemala released their audit data. But the reason why academics have been so obsessed with writing about audits and corruption in Brazil is that Brazil has lotteries to figure out which municipalities would get selected for audits each time. And the idea is that the lotteries about which municipalities would get selected for audit would get rid of these sort of selection problems that might cause biases in our data analyses. So yeah, I had found these audit data from Guatemala. But yeah, nobody believed me that the audit data weren't biased. So I went in and used all the tools from my PhD. I ran all sorts of regular regressions, logistic regressions, but that wasn't enough because nowadays, particularly with some of the more recent Nobel Prizes, there's really a standard for not just looking at correlations, but being able to figure out causality. So I actually looked in this light using a method called a regression discontinuity design, which would give what's called a natural experiment. And there I was looking at when was the mayor having the same party as the president, and when did they get elected in close elections as opposed to the elections where you knew who was going to win ahead of time. And so I did all of this work. And yeah, because nobody believed me at the start that, hey, the audit data in Guatemala weren't biased, I ended up writing a whole nother paper and then my dissertation on measuring corruption using audits. And my substantive topic was just like one of the chapters as well. But yeah, in the process of doing all this quantitative work and figuring out that, hey, the municipal audits in Guatemala weren't biased, and even though only around 88% of the municipalities were getting audited every year, we could use these data. I was also doing some qualitative analysis to figure out, well, how does audit independence actually work? And then in the meantime, the World Bank came out with this Supreme Audit Agency Independence Index. So they kind of stole my thunder a little bit, but it actually wasn't too big of a problem. They actually ended up saving me time. But I think actually the findings of this index are quite interesting, because Guatemala scored, and that's the Contraloría General de Cuentas, the Comptroller General, they actually scored 8.5 out of 10 on the World Bank's index, which if you look at all the potential places and scores, is 4th out of 16, which is a really good score, and you wouldn't maybe expect that from Guatemala. So yeah, we actually have some really good audit data in Guatemala. But what are these audit data actually good for? So as part of my PhD dissertation, I reviewed thousands and thousands of audits, including some line by line. Sophia actually helped me back in the day with this. Yeah, what is actually in these audits? Well, it's money missing from the petty cash drawer. It's bureaucrats using municipal vehicles for personal purposes, missing receipts for small stuff, procurement procedures not followed for small works. In short, this is basically small stuff. So in the morning, we were talking about grand corruption and some of the bigger things. And right now, the reality is that in Guatemala is that the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, this UN-backed agency, CICIG, as it's known by its Spanish acronym, is no longer here. Guatemala also doesn't have a World Bank integrity vice presidency like Lisa's team, with tons of lawyers who have not just one law degree, but sometimes two, and who have been doing this for many, many years to be able to help with some of these investigations. It's really, really hard. So I think audits can actually be really useful in this context, because they're capturing little stuff that's not going to make big actors really upset. And often in these cases where you have grand corruption and you have big actors who are upset, they get involved in the process, sometimes things end. So what I'm proposing here is that the audit information from Guatemala actually be disseminated to the right actors. So there's some work from Boma Mukherjee at Penn State that looked at giving anti-corruption work to business associations and showed that it actually fostered collective action. We have, I guess Alicia was here, but yeah, we have representatives from civil society, and giving them actually the audit data and saying, hey, here's the report. What do you actually want to take into account? There was also Sherry here yesterday from the Accountability Project. You could also shine a light on the very good actors as opposed to just sort of the naming and shaming. You can highlight the work that's being done really well. And I also want to draw a couple of lessons from Mexico and Brazil that might be relevant for Guatemala as well. So Mexico actually releases their audits every year on a specific timetable. And they do this because each year when audits are released, well, they have a media and a press event about it. And this way you can actually get people to care about the audits, that, hey, this is the audit day, this is when we think about it, versus right now the audit reports in Guatemala are being released as the reports come out. So one thing I'd propose then is that Guatemala follow Mexico's lead there and have the audits released on a specific time frame on specific days. And actually, if you look at the Google Trends online, you can see that like when Mexico releases their audits, like the word like auditoría like spikes in the Google Trends. So it's actually generating that collective action from the bottom up. And then in addition, in Brazil, there's been some work that's looked at audits and corruption. And what they found is that when the audits are released close to the election and the results are disseminated over the radio, well, the corrupt mayors don't actually get reelected. So yeah, we can try to use some of the media to get involved with these issues as well. But yeah, this is just some preliminary thoughts. But yeah, use these audit data. The Guatemalan audit data are actually good. I've ran them through every test imaginable, correlation, causation, backwards, forwards. So yeah, you have a resource. Let's use it.
Thank you, Mike. And before we start taking questions, Mike gave a couple shout outs to folks in the audience, and I just wanted to amplify those at risk of embarrassing the people that were shouted out. So Sofia Gonzalez works on my team at USIP, and she and Megs Blum helped put together this event. They were huge players. Without them, it literally would not have happened. And then the other shout out was to Sherry from Accountability Lab, one of my favorite anti-corruption NGOs. And like you mentioned, there's this notion that little stuff that won't get big actors upset. And Accountability Lab, if I have this right, much of your approach is sort of hyper-local, looking at instances of people being denied access, for example, to municipal services, and the sense of outrage and concern around corruption that generates, and then driving things forward. And then somebody else, Welby, it was you, talked about the lived experience. And I think that, too, feeds into Accountability Lab's work. Anyway, so just a bunch of shout outs before we start taking questions. And perhaps we would take questions first from folks online because they won't have a chance to schmooze and network during the coffee break. So I'm not sure how we do this, but sorry. Okay. So I think let's say we have, because I don't want to deny people access to the coffee break. So let's take 10, 15 minutes for questions. And then we'll break. So any questions from the audience?
Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew Siebel. I work on the Nonviolent Action Program here, which deals a lot with social movements and collective action in that sense. I really, really enjoyed this panel. Thank you all very much for taking the time. Michael, I'm a fellow social scientist, love the RDD stuff. I'm going to not take a swing at it now to not bore these people, but nice work. That sounds really cool. So I just want to highlight comments from Welby's conversation about the need to kind of locate collective action in people's lived experiences and grassroots on the ground, and also the fact that there's not necessarily a critical mass for anti-corruption work. I thought those were two really important threads that kind of prelude my question, which is I want to understand how you all see the relationship between social movements and business interests, which I think are different. So some of the examples of collective action that we've heard from this panel involve, at least the way I heard it, business leaders getting together to solve a collective action problem amongst themselves that is mutually beneficial to them. So I think that's important, but it's not the same thing as coordinating with a grassroots anti-corruption social movement. And so I want to understand more about how you panelists understand the relationship between social movement activists and businesses in spaces like Guatemala. I mean, I think Michael starts to get at more of this when you were talking about the timing of the release of audit data, which implies like popular interest in these things. But I'm kind of looking for more here. I want to understand how you think businesses should be engaging with social movements in these spaces.
Feeling the tension of the guilt that I have for having talked too much in the first time, and but I've been convinced to say a little bit on this. It's such a wonderful question, and maybe I'll start by talking. We've talked about digital reforms for improved public governance and improved private compliance in our digital tools for rule of law and inclusive recovery. But part of the commitment as well is to use digital tools to support and facilitate the social movement side and the lived experience. So, I mean, why is lived experience under-indexed in what happens, and why are social movements so hard to get an adequate governance level response to, even when they're so powerful in the street? It's in part transaction costs. It's very hard to do. It's very expensive in some sense historically to do massive, complex coordination among many different people at a grassroots level. But that's like the theme of digital transformation. And so digital tools must go directly to that. And so businesses who have, in some sense, privileged access to digital tools must make a commitment to using digital tools drive down the costs of complex coordination within their own grassroots stakeholders. Those stakeholders are customers to us, they're citizens to other actors, they're members of social movements, and they've already set an agenda. And it's not necessarily the same agenda as the question that a business-funded focus group wants to start with. And so in that sense, commit to real design thinking. In other words, don't ask the question, ask what questions should be asked, and recognize there's diversity whenever you move to the grassroots instead of taking high institutional change, and therefore businesses must increasingly be conveners of diversified action, which means sometimes an organization needs to take its own decision based upon input from the grassroots, but in order to rebuild trust at a meta level, you also need to get in the habit of facilitating a diverse set of actions. So Walmart may say, well, actually, I'll give a specific example. In our people-powered policymaking digital platform, we just recently did a sort of sprint of 2 weeks and another sprint of 2 weeks, another sprint of 2 weeks of convened digitally enabled synchronous and asynchronous conversations with 1,300 MSME suppliers and would-be suppliers, people who haven't made it into the supply chain yet, in Mexico. Doing all the things I said thus far right. Like we just came in and said, what are the things that are concerning you? What are the things you want action on, and so forth. Licensing and permitting came up and so forth. We said, we're not trying to hide behind one-way glass. We're like, oh, well, that's something we're actively interested in and could probably help on. Let's talk through that. By the way, every session always ends with a thank you for giving us voice. So the message, the medium is the message here. In part, partially what people want in the grassroots is agency, is respect. And so for that reason, just doing it is its own value. And I think so much so that one of the reasons companies should do, I'm not planning on building our own social movement in favor of this sort of convening of business stakeholders on my faith in the goodness of the average business leader. It's because if they don't do it, they're going to be behind the curve. You better do it now because you can, and everybody knows you always should have, and you had a good excuse for not doing so, which was the Coase theorem, and that's being partly revoked by digital tools. So get with it. So that's what we're doing. As we do it, we certainly discover that we're participating in social. I mean, our customers have been out there in the streets working on things. They're already way ahead. We don't have to say, oh, thank you so much for that input. We who have been assigned the role of deciding and doing things, we can be like, oh, wow, okay, run, go, that sort of thing. So I do think there are a lot of things to say on the downside, like where all the pitfalls are, but I already just talked more than I meant to. So.
Thanks, Welby.
Hi, this is a question from the webcast. I'm going to read it. The most important thing is effectiveness. How do you intend to convince ordinary, simple people that fighting corruption will pay off? They're used to the fact that nothing is for free.
So that's probably a question anybody could answer. Welby, given that you already answered a question, maybe we'll leave it to the other three. Anybody thoughts?
So there was actually a question we didn't get to, and I think it's an important one. It had to do about how do you make these initiatives sustainable, and I think that has to do with the effectiveness. And I think how do you get people to buy in? It's a tough one, because as long as one person is willing to pay a bribe, someone is going to stand there and ask. So to make it sustainable, to make it effective, to get the buy-in, I really do think you have to have that critical mass. And again, we're going back to collective action. And I think what I'm going to steal something Tanya had said in the context of incentives, and I'm going to adapt it to the collective action context. She had said there are really 4 things that are critically important. And so the first one she mentioned, you need to have an action that's real. So how do you get people to buy in? How do you make it effective? You have a tangible goal. You don't have this pie in the sky, we're going to have zero corruption, it's going to be this utopia where no one ever does anything wrong because it's the right thing to do. I don't think that's sustainable, because the reality is, and off the record, you're never going to have 0% corruption because the world is not a utopia. People are going to do things that they shouldn't. So the reality is you find a tangible goal. And this is the issue we want to address. These are the folks that agree to address this issue. And then you have to have, Tanya's second point, you have to have a clear goal. This is what we want to address, and this is our goal. Our goal is, again, Masson, to reduce the asks for bribes as we bring our ships into this port. So you have a clear goal. Then you have to make it known. And that goes to the question, I think, about how do you make it enforceable. People know that this is the goal. People know that these are the expectations, and this is what we are going to work toward. And then the fourth item that Tanya mentioned has to work in practice. So your goal has to be something that's fair. I think it's fair to say we're not going to pay bribes when we want to come into your port. You have to have something that's enforceable, and that goes to, it can be incentives or it can be disincentives. There will be consequences if this is not followed, and you have to have a track record. You show it works, and if you show it works, I do think that's how people can start buying in, because if you don't see anything changing or anything happening, people give up. So you have to have those four things, and again, you have to have something that's real, you have to have a clear goal, it has to be known to people, and you have to show that it's working in practice. And that means you have to have some type of an enforcement mechanism. And hopefully with all of that, you have a sustainable approach that also then brings people on board, because they actually see the change happening. And it gives them confidence to maybe even then take the next step and address the next goal. Maybe it's permitting. So I think it's you start with these small chunks, and then hopefully they can then build into something bigger. Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa. That was great. And I think we have time for one more question, I believe, if there is one. We have two. So if folks on the panel, if you could answer very briefly.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Soledad Garcia Muñoz. Currently, I'm a Distinguished Fellow of Georgetown Law, Human Rights Institute, and until last year, I was the first Special Rapporteur on Economic, Social, Cultural, and Environmental Rights of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. I really enjoyed the panel. I thank you for having me, especially to Welby, for giving me the information. And I would like to introduce an additional aspect that are precisely human rights and the protection of environment as a special obligation and responsibility both of governments and states and business sectors. And one of my dreams, and when I was the special rapporteur, I had the privilege to develop the first regional report on this matter, a hemispheric report, is how we can to connect more and better both worlds, the world of economy and the world of human rights, human dignity, environmental protection. And I think this is especially important for Guatemala. And Guatemala is a country that I am really fan of, and I really would love to see Guatemala as a model in this connection of approaches. Thank you.
So, not to put you on the spot, Tanya, but you spoke a bit about the suite of standards that the OECD puts out that cover labor, environment, human rights in this realm. Would you be comfortable answering this question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is, I take it even not as a question. I think that this is kind of a thought which I fully support, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about it. Yes, I did mention that my organization not only looks at anti-corruption and corruption and trying to kind of look at it in isolation. We look at different things, and we have something that is called responsible business conduct, part of my organization. So we specifically look at the things that you exactly mentioned right now, that it all has to be we talk about the integrated approach. So anti-corruption is just one element of something that should be in place, and that is the environmental, social, and governance standards that each corporation has to meet, or each business has to meet, because in the growing world where the borders are becoming more porous and more theoretical, and the governments are responsible for just one territory, the corporations are really gaining space. And because they are responsible, or they are gaining space, and they are running the world in many ways, they also, the responsibility comes with this. And I think that this is something that we as an international organization expect of the corporations, not only of the governments, that there should be these kind of things going in concert. So it should be not just the anti-corruption, but the human rights, but the environment, and other types of governance and social responsibilities. And then that is expected both from the governments and the businesses. So I fully support it. And as I said, we look at it more and more. And just recently, my organization has adopted a recommendation that goes specifically towards this issue and talks about the due diligence guidance for the responsible business conduct. So this is something on the agendas of the governments and of the businesses.
Yeah, and Tanya, thank you for pointing out the due diligence dimension, because that's when it gets real. Yeah, so real quickly, we'll take one more question from my colleague, Dana Berenger, who I can personally say I've learned a lot about anti-corruption in Mexico from you, Dana. She also works at the Center for International Private Enterprise. Dana?
Thank you, Frank, and thank you all for your opinions, insights, and also visual presentations of the Venn diagram. I appreciate it. So I think a little bit more specifically, over the past decade, we've seen a significant increase in the use of investment screening mechanisms and tools such as ultimate beneficial ownership registries as a way to combat corruption and protect national security interests from non-friendly actors. And this is typically kind of a government, like, top-down policy approach, but we have seen some pretty strong examples of collective action between the private sector, civil society, and governments to support the implementation of these tools and these mechanisms. For SIPE, we've been lucky enough to work with a partner in Chile to support the passage or near passage of legislative reform to establish an ultimate beneficial ownership registry. But it's a very different context than other countries in Latin America, let alone the world, right? There's a strong political will amongst the private sector. So my question for all of you, and I think you have all kind of touched on this at different points in your various presentations, but how do you build that base for collective action? How do you generate that will when it's maybe not as obvious or present? And how do you find that intersection between the three different circles, right, to find common ground where you can work together?
So, Mike, I don't know, would you be comfortable taking this one?
Maybe Lisha should answer it, just because I know the World Bank was working on that when I left. Diomedes Beroa was working on that. I don't know, did you guys move further with that, with the beneficial ownership, or not so much?
So on UBO, yes. In World Bank procurement context, yes. But they have made movement there, and that is something that they're now looking at more than they had in the past. But I think the specific question is, how do you? May I steal this? How do you fill this little circle? And that's the $1 million question. I think it's. I actually think, it goes to the first question that's been asked about the relationship between social movements and business interests. So, how do you get where's that convergence? And I think the convergence, and I might flip it over to Welby on this, I think the convergence may in some cases come when it hits the bottom line of business. I think that can be a motivator. for business to get on board. I think that there's a convergence where for government officials where there are consequences for their bad behavior. I think that sometimes you can have a convergence to Tanya's point. If there's an incentive for business to do something, we're going to. I think one of the examples that was given was, we may get fewer inspections if we're on a green list. So I think it's, and then again you have the disincentives. We don't want to get sanctioned. So I think the convergence is trying to figure out what's at stake for each of the various stakeholders. And how do you kind of tap into that and find that common ground? And I think part of it is what's the enforcement on the government end, what's the enforcement vis-a-vis private sector, what's the enforcement vis-a-vis public sector actors, and again, how does it hit the business? Because their incentive at the end of the day, and I think it's great that there are the incentives for companies to do clean business, et cetera. But at the end of the day, if you're a profit organization, you're looking to make profit. So, how do you impact that? And what matters to each of these different actors, I think is really where that convergence comes. I don't know.
I can also add from the government angle, a lot of these things can be covered in asset declarations. So bureaucrats have to make asset declarations in many countries around the world. And one of the things that they can list on there is whether they own a business, right? Just in case there was some sort of conflict of interest, if there's procurement. So yeah, I mean, if I don't know exactly how asset declarations work in Guatemala, but that could be something to list there. Of course, enforcement is another issue, but just to sort of get that on the list could start.
I'll only say that Gary Kalman has a great story on this, in which he was like, well, wouldn't the banks be in favor of this? Gives them some protections. And so he went to the American Banking Association, and they were like, well, nobody ever asked us to support this in the past. Sure. And so all of a sudden he had the banks. And of course, who do the banks have? A huge client base of businesses that are desperate to have a good relationship with banks so they can get finance. So I like that. It shows. Oh, and he said, by the way, he came back to some of Transparency International. Oh, Gary, of course, for those who don't know, is the head of Transparency International US. And he came back and told some of his civil society friends, and they were like, what? You're working with the banks? No, this is not good. But there you go, collective action.
Thanks, Welby. And just by way of context, so Gary was gathering support for what became the Corporate Transparency Act in the U.S., which is the U.S. version of the Beneficial Ownership Transparency, the UBO legislation. And in our anti-corruption circles, he's a sort of this prophetic near genius figure who a lot of us look up to. So with that, I think I will say a big thank you to Tanya for staying up till 9:30 at night, to Mike for making the journey from Texas, for Welby and Lisa, for you didn't travel so far, but you made some big contributions. And I'd like, if you don't mind, perhaps we could give them a big hand of applause. Yeah. And so we'll take a bit of a break for coffee and snacks, and then we'll reconvene here. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for listening to this event. If you'd like to listen to more events or explore our other podcasts, visit usip.org/podcasts.